The first thing you notice about a cave is the way the light dies. In Okinawa, that absence of light became a weapon, a silent strategy that would shape months of hell and the fate of thousands of people. This story begins not with a grand naval engagement, but with stone and human calculation. The caves of Okinawa would become a theater where geography turned into doctrine and suffering became tactical reality. Okinawa sat like a strategic pebble between empires and sea lines, and commanders understood its importance through maps and models. The island was not smooth. It was a landscape of ridges, plateaus, and pocketed limestone that invited tunneling and concealment. Those contours made it ideal for a defense born out of desperation and doctrine. The caves were not incidental. They were the backbone of a plan to make invasion into attrition and agony. Geology created opportunities that human hands eagerly took advantage of under a wartime imperative. Natural sea caves and karst formations were expanded and connected until they became something engineered rather than accidental. Japanese forces combined natural cavities with dug tunnels and man-made caverns. The result was an elaborate subterranean environment that blurred the line between shelter and fortification. Japanese military doctrine in 1945 had evolved toward defense, in depth across the Pacific, and Okinawa became the proving ground for a grim new strategy. Commanders believed the way to bleed an invading force was not through beaches, but through prolonged inland attrition. That doctrinal shift placed the cave system at the center of operations. Underground networks were designed to slow, confuse, and destroy the momentum of an amphibious invasion. Preparing caves was neither simple nor purely improvisational. It was detailed engineering carried out under strict secrecy. Entrances were enlarged and camouflaged, while chambers were lit with kerosene lamps and ventilated through shafts. Soldiers carved firing positions, built storage bays, and lined passages with timber whenever possible. They turned hollowed rock into a functional labyrinth capable of housing men, ammunition, and civilian families too. Camouflage and deceptive entrances made the caves lethal before a shot was fired. From above, the island looked unremarkable, but hidden openings were often masked with foliage, rubble, or even false burial mounds. Approaching units could be funneled into kill zones without realizing where the danger originated. The Japanese understood concealment as a multiplier for their limited firepower and resources. Inside those caves, multiple lives intertwined in precarious proximity, and civilians often shared airspace with soldiers. Families were evacuated into these dugouts to escape bombardment, creating crowded, unsanitary conditions that became part of the battle. Life in a cave combined the familiarity of home with the constant physics of war, sleep, fear, and mealtime rituals. All occurred under the same roof of rock where gunfire could erupt without warning. The Japanese garrison stocked ammunition, food, and medical supplies deep within the tunnels to prolong resistance and sustain surprise counterattacks. These stockpiles allowed defenders to withstand bombardment and resupply isolated firing positions. Supply caches were often hidden behind false walls or in secondary chambers that required knowledge of the layout. That institutional knowledge made it difficult for attackers to neutralize the system quickly. Many cave complexes were not isolated rooms but sprawling systems connected by tortuous passages and communication shafts. These passageways allowed defenders to move during bombardment and reappear where least expected. The layout facilitated decentralized command, enabling small groups to operate independently yet coordinate through prearranged signals. The interconnectedness of the caves bred an economy of movement that frustrated conventional assault tactics. The defense plan used the caves to create a layer cake of resistance across the island, and attackers found themselves fighting room by room. Each chamber could be held by a small force and roughly supported without large troop concentrations. Defense in depth meant that losing an outer position did not lead to collapse, but rather a staged, brutal delay. The result was attrition that inflicted disproportionate casualties for the invaders compared to territorial gain. American planners expected Okinawa to yield after naval bombardment and set-piece infantry assaults, and they found themselves surprised by subterranean resistance. For us forces, the caves produced an operational shock that forced immediate adaptation. The first contact with the caves reshaped daily tactics for entire units. Close-quarters combat replaced long-range fire, and static lines disappeared under the new demands of underground clearing. Once inside, fighting changed in scale and nature, and small teams often bore the brunt of clearing operations. Combat in enclosed spaces neutralized many technological advantages and turned every firefight into a personal, viscera-inducing encounter. Soldiers learned quickly that movement, teamwork, and improvisation mattered more than firepower alone. Each room demanded a choreographed approach of grenades, bayonets, and quick assaults to prevent being outflanked or pinned down. Flamethrowers became a tragic utility in the struggle to clear caves, and their presence brought a desperate calculus to both sides. The weapon could neutralize a position quickly, but it also turned chambers into infernos with lethal consequences for all inside. Demolition charges and explosives were used to collapse passages and deny reoccupation, and those tactics left the cave infrastructure deeply altered. Those tools solved tactical problems, but created moral and structural wreckage that lasted long after combat ended. The psychological impact of cave fighting rippled through units in a way that ammunition reports could not capture. Claustrophobia, the smell of smoke, and the steady thud of unseen bodies created a mental grind that frayed cohesion and courage. Men who had survived open battlefield hells found subterranean fighting uniquely corrosive. The lack of daylight and the intimate proximity to enemy bodies reshaped how soldiers thought about death and survival. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the presence of civilians inside caves added a terrible moral dimension to every assault. Women, children, and the elderly often became part of the defensive calculus, whether they wished to or not. Counting dead in caves was messy and incomplete because bodies were found in hidden chambers while records were destroyed or never kept. The human cost included combat deaths, suicides, and indirect losses caused by disease and starvation. Medics and stretcher bearers faced impossible choices when evacuating wounded from tunnels, and medical support was often improvisational and insufficient. Carrying the injured through narrow passages under fire required organization and uncommon courage. Several wounds that might have been survivable in open terrain became fatal without sunlight and proper sanitation. The logistics of care were as much a battlefield constraint as ammunition or food. Surrenders were rare inside the caves because of ideology, orders, and fear of what surrender might bring. Many defenders chose to fight to the death rather than emerge into uncertain captivity. Those holdouts complicated clearing operations and prolonged localized resistance. The absence of organized surrender meant that combat often continued in pockets, long after main lines had advanced. When the battle moved past the active fighting, specialized units began the grim work of clearing and neutralizing remaining cave threats. This process involved demolition, mapping, and sometimes the discovery of unanticipated passages. Clearing operations could take weeks or months and demanded careful reconnaissance and patience. The island was never simply secured with a single assault. It required persistent subterranean vigilance. As tunnels were opened, the world discovered scenes that shocked many and hardened others, and those discoveries complicated the moral narrative. Bodies of soldiers and civilians were found together, and the stories they told were often fragmented and tragic. Some discoveries revealed atrocities, while others documented the desperate measures taken to survive. Each chamber's contents became evidence of the fierce intimacy that cave warfare produced between life and death. The structural impact of intense blasting and repeated fires left many caves unstable and dangerous long after the battle concluded. Collapsed passages made some areas inaccessible and created ongoing hazards for returning civilians. The island's geology was altered by human violence, and hillside scars served as constant reminders. Rebuilding infrastructure required both engineering effort and psychological repair for communities that had sheltered under rock. The human cost of the caves extended beyond immediate casualties into decades of trauma and social disruption for Okinawa's population. Survivors carried invisible wounds from cramped living, loss of family, and memories of fighting in darkness. Those scars influenced Okinawa's post-war identity and politics as the island navigated occupation and reconstruction. The caves became a touchstone for collective memory and intergenerational pain. In Okinawa today, memorials and museums attempt to explain what happened beneath the island and to honor the victims of subterranean warfare. Exhibits show artifacts, maps, and testimonies that make the abstract real for visitors. These commemorations are not neutral. They are contested sites where memory, politics, and grief intersect. The cave stories remain raw and central to how the island remembers the war and its consequences. Historians still debate whether the strategy of fighting from caves was a calculated necessity or a tragic cultural choice. Some argue it prolonged the war and cost countless lives, while others emphasize the logic of defense against overwhelming naval and air power. These debates matter because they shape how we judge leadership and policy in moments of existential threat. The cave defenses force us to weigh strategic reasoning against human cost in stark terms. The lessons of Okinawa's caves are surprisingly modern and disturbingly relevant to urban and subterranean warfare today. Weaponry and tactics change, but the moral problems of fighting in confined civilian spaces remain stubbornly similar. Military planners now train for tunnel clearing and underground operations precisely because history has shown how effective such defenses can be. Technology may reduce casualties, but it cannot erase the ethical dilemmas inherent in war under roofs of rock. There is a philosophical tilt to the story of Okinawa's caves that resists easy closure, and it forces reflection on how humans respond to existential pressure. Stone shelters can protect bodies while erasing the distinctions between combatant and non-combatant. Caves therefore become a mirror. They show how strategy can transform compassion into calculus. The subterranean landscape reveals a human propensity to turn shelter into a weapon and to pay a steep price for doing so. The legacy of Okinawa's caves still informs conversations about civilian protection, rules of engagement, and the limits of military necessity. Policymakers and soldiers alike must reckon with the fact that geography can be weaponized against people. Remembering the caves means remembering the lives that were squeezed between doctrine and stone. Those remembrances help frame the ethical responsibilities of those who plan and those who fight. For Okinawans, the caves are both physical places and narrative anchors that shape identity and memory. Annual commemorations, family stories, and local history keep the underground past in the public eye and the national conversation. Their voices remind outsiders that history is not only about strategy charts and casualty lists, it is also about people who slept in darkness, who lost family, and who later worked to rebuild lives on sunlit ground. When we study the caves of Okinawa, we are studying a complex interaction of geology, doctrine, and human survival instincts. Each tunnel tells a story of adaptive engineering, desperate tactics, and the limits of wartime humanity. Those stories complicate simple narratives of victory and defeat and demand that we consider the moral price of turning shelter into a battlefield. The caves remain a cautionary example for future generations. The philosophical twist at the end is unsettling but important. Caves that protect can also imprison, and strategies that promise survival can exact irreversible costs. Understanding Okinawa means recognizing that war transforms the environment into an extension of human will for good and for ill. If this history teaches anything, it is that geography is never neutral in war, and that decisions made beneath rock have consequences above ground for generations. Remembering and learning are obligations to the past and to the future. If this account gave you a new perspective on the Battle of Okinawa, consider how memory and landscape shape each other. Subscribe to follow more stories that probe the intersections of geography, power, and human cost. Thank you for watching and reflecting on this difficult chapter of history. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and share the video with someone who cares about learning from the past.